So, Andrea, we've dealt with divisions, healthcare, immigration. What other interesting data points do we have about 2025 as we move towards the end of the year? I know you've done some interesting research on religion, about how America is different from the rest of the world on that front too.
Yeah, so we are kind of in a strange middle ground when it comes to religion in the United States. And some of it depends on how you define religion. So and maybe I'll just ask you, do you consider yourself a religious person?
Definitely not.
No, me neither. If you ask most people in the United States, or about 50% of Americans would have an answer roughly like yours, which is like, no. Some of those people in the definitely not category are still vaguely, say, Christian or vaguely part of some other tradition. Some of us are atheists, some of us are agnostic, but there's still a decent chunk of Americans. And again, depending on how you measure it, it's about half of Americans, a little more, a little less, depending on the strictness or the intensity of the threshold for religious. But about half of Americans are religious in some form or another. And this formal religion, as opposed to spiritual or something like that. This is much more than most people in other developed democracies. So again, the kind of Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, Americans are much more religious compared to our, let's say, our peer countries politically and economically than the rest of the world. We are far less religious than the vast majority of, say, the global South, a lot of Asia, a lot of Africa. And so we occupy this strange middle ground. And so I was curious, why don't we look more like the other countries, our neighbor Canada, and why aren't we as religious as a bunch of other countries? Why are we sort of religious? And the answer, as far as I was able to find, and there's been a lot, decades of research on this, but the answer is this kind of interesting story. The one that I found most compelling is this interesting story about how the United States began, which was we initially started as a country that very much deliberately separated church and state. And that meant that the churches were free to operate kind of like businesses where they could recruit. There's a nice language where it's a marketplace for souls. So churches in the United States were very capitalistic in this way, where they went around and said, okay, how can I appeal to the most people? How can I recruit people to my church? Whereas in other countries, for example, in Europe, where a lot of the people from the United States came from, the church was kind of just in the center of town and it was part of a way of life. So they didn't have to like adapt or be appealing in any sort of way, market themselves. So churches kind of hit the ground running in the United States as this sort of, let me appeal to the most people and outcompete other churches. And part of this meant that if I was in a church in the United States and I didn't like it, in other countries where there was just sort of like one Catholic church, my choice was either stay or leave the church altogether. Whereas in the United States, if I'm in one particular church or one particular faith, I say, I don't love this. I can just go across the street to a different church. Like churches are like Starbucks in the United States in that way. And then the third piece of the puzzle is that the United States was specifically settled by people seeking a place where they could practice their religion freely. I think we often conflate the fact that we began with the separation of church and state as saying, okay, that's because church isn't important. The separation of church and state was because church was very important. So out of the gates, we just set ourselves up for a country where church would actually play a much more active role in our lives, as opposed to places where the church is sort of ceremoniously more central, but doesn't actually kind of get involved in our lives in that way. And if you think about it, even today, the church for a lot of people is a source of great community. It's a source of friends. It's a social network. It's a place where you do economic networking. And so the church is really a center of community in the United States in a way that it really didn't end up being in a lot of other countries.
This idea of the marketplace of souls has actually quite literally come true. I want to get briefly to your predictions, your data-driven predictions, Andrea, for 2026. But before we get there, can data scientists tell us anything about relative misery? A lot of people, when they're asked about 2025, will reply that this was the year of misery, of anxiety, where no one seems to be happy anymore. What does the data science tell us about that in 2025?
I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record because a lot of these questions, the answer is something like, well, it depends on what you mean by misery and what you mean by happiness. And a very unpopular view, which I think is relevant to why we all feel so miserable, a very unpopular view among a lot of the quantitative research on happiness is that things are great. If you think about things like health outcomes, longevity, conflict, the percentage of the world, not just the United States, the percentage of the world that is living under relative stability, is relatively well off, has enough to eat, has enough shelter, would suggest that we don't have anything to complain about. Just saying that is going to get me canceled in a lot of circles, because you can immediately spring to mind all of these terrible injustices. Of course there's conflict, of course there's famine, of course there's disease, of course there's violence. And so if you say misery in terms of how I personally feel in my life, or how I feel the world is going, or is the world headed in a way that is good, if you kind of move away from the more, I don't even want to say material, but sort of the more tangible measures of how well off someone is, and move to the more internal experiences, we are more miserable. There is more anxiety. There is more misery. It varies, by age and cohort and all kinds of things. But in general, we are more stressed out. Why? That remains to be seen. I mean, this goes back to the idea that a lot of these research projects take a long time to sort of sift through. Anyone can pick their story. Well, it's political discourse is awful. Well, it's economic mobility has plummeted. Well, it's the cost of living. You can tell lots of compelling stories. And going back to your original question, you can certainly pick data to support those stories. But I think really teasing out the multiple causal reasons behind, say, kind of a heightened emotional unwellness in the United States, I would consider that an open question.
Well, let's move to 2026, which is indeed literally an open question.
Yes.
You boast that you believe in curiosity, imagination, and creativity. For you, those are the engines of the future.
Yes.
2026 still lies in the future. What would you like to happen, Andrea? I mean, I'm not going to ask you as a data scientist to predict the future, because you will no doubt say that you're no better at predicting it than anyone else, anyone who does or doesn't have the data. But what would you like to happen in 2026? If we're talking again this time next year, what would you like to report in terms of shifts in the data?
I appreciate the question, and I particularly appreciate not having to pretend to be a fortune teller. It's going to be an exciting year for Libras, I think is the headline. I'm going to kind of be on brand here and say that I hope that that if we speak again this time next year, we can look back and say, gosh, we approached a lot of our biggest problems in the world, in the country, social problems, political problems, physical problems. We approached it with more curiosity and more empathy than we did previously. And it's very easy and rich for me to just sort of sit here, in a room, not in a conflict zone, not being actively attacked, knock on wood, and say those things. But I really think that there's a lot of space for Americans to resolve our differences, not all of our differences, but many of our differences, if we just pause and say, I wonder why the other side has the beliefs that they do, as opposed to jumping to the conclusion of, oh, they have those beliefs because they are racist, because they don't care about America, because they are mentally ill, or whatever, causal leap we want to take that's convenient for our point of view. I hope that we can come back in a year and say, we actually took a minute to approach these horrible, difficult, thorny problems with curiosity. And we said things like, I wonder why people believe this. I wonder why we can't seem to actually have a conversation. What could it take to get us to sit down and talk about an immigration policy that most of us feel is kind of ethically responsible? That's lofty, but I will offer that as the hope. I also hope we can approach AI with that kind of curiosity as well. I think that's a really big risk to everything in the critical thinking curiosity land.
Well, I hope AI approaches us in that way too.
Agreed.
I don't think anyone would disagree with you, Andrea. The question is how.
Yeah.
You're also, in your history, you've been a circus performer. You're a stand-up comic too.
Yes.
Do we need to do crazy things to achieve crazy results? You know that if we improve our life, maybe we can save the world too. None of us individually can save the world, but I'm not suggesting everyone should become a circus performer or even a comedian. But do we need to think radically, so to speak, in terms of what we do and how we think of ourselves?
I mean, I think that a lot of the fuel for curiosity and for wondering about how someone came to a different set of beliefs or preferences or behaviors from me, I think to get into that mindset, it can be helpful to do things outside of our comfort zone. And that certainly doesn't have to be stand-up or circus or whatever. But I think that getting out of our own regular routine, the way that I always go to work, the people that I talk to or don't talk to, and then I come home and then I read the internet and then I feel bad. I think that there's something very beautiful and powerful about doing something new, particularly something that you are bad at, and just saying like, yeah, I'm not great at this and it's not the end of the world. I think we're so afraid to be wrong and to seem silly or dumb that spills over into our mindset about the world as well. I have to be right and they have to be wrong and I have to be good and they have to be bad. Whereas I think a simple way to sort of get out of our same, kind of echo chambers in our brain is to physically put ourselves in a room. And I'm not saying, go bowling with your greatest enemy, but I am saying, what if you spent an evening going to the roller skating rink as opposed to doom scrolling? I'm not a psychologist. This isn't therapy advice, but I have found in my own life that one of the best ways to sort of get myself out of a mindset rut or get myself out of a position of sitting and being like, why are all these other people doing these terrible things, is to just go and do something new, whatever that is. And you sort of just get to, by accident, interact with people who are a different age from you, have different views from you, have different problems in life. And I really think we cannot overstate the importance of that kind of small thing.
Wise words from Andrea. Maybe we should have a show entitled Bowling with Bin Laden.
There we go.
Fascinating conversation. Andrea Jones-Rooy. We'll have to meet again this time next year. You're a data scientist, but a very human one. Happy New Year, healthy New Year, wise New Year. Thank you very much.